You may have heard that there are many scholars today who believe there is a secret within the 5 books of Moses. It was not originally a unified document, but was originally 4 separate sources that a redactor later combined into one. These original 4 sources had differences and contradictory stories, like different flood accounts or 2 separate creation accounts. The redactor combined them, attempting to make a unified document. This is called the documentary hypothesis, and it is a well-respected theory in the scholarship surrounding the Pentateuch and has a lot of scholarly proponents. However, there are also a lot of scholars that have challenged the documentary hypothesis and have argued the 5 books of Moses have a lot more unity than we realize. The documentary hypothesis is the view that the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy were originally 4 separate sources called J, E, P, and D. J stands for the Yahweh source because it mostly wrote about God using the term Yahweh. E stands for the Elohim source because it mostly used the term Elohim for God. P is the priestly source, which included many of the priestly laws and holiness standards, and D stands for Deuteronomy. At some point, someone combined J, E, and P into the books we call Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and then Deuteronomy was included at the end as Moses' final speech to Israel. When this happened, many stories of Israel's history were combined. It's theorized there were 2 creation accounts that became Genesis 1 and 2. There were 2 flood stories combined into one, 2 stories of Joseph being sold into slavery, and 2 accounts of the plagues in Egypt. A redactor allegedly took all these stories and combined them into their present form. An early and very popular form of the documentary hypothesis was proposed by Julius Wellhausen. He said there were originally 2 sources, J and E. E was the history of the northern kingdom of Israel, and J was the history from the kingdom of Judah. It may have been written as early as the reign of Solomon. After the northern kingdom fell, the 2 were combined into J-E. Later during Josiah's reforms, D was produced. And then in the 6th century, P was written and later combined with J and E. Now, although a lot of scholars that hold to the documentary hypothesis agree there were originally 4 separate sources, almost all of them disagree on what they were, when they were combined, how they were combined, when each hypothesized source was written, and many other minor issues. To cover some examples, Yehezkel Kaufman argued P was actually much older and should date to the 8th century BCE. Zioni Zevit suggested P could be as old as the 10th century. Gordon Wenham suggested J and E were really originally one document. Noose moves E to the 7th century. John Van Seters dissented from the consensus and placed J at a much later date, whereas Carr Berg pushed J back to around the 10th century. Erhard Bloom argued there was originally 2 compositions, a D and a P composition. Blenkinsop eliminates a J source. Scott denies the existence of J and E, and instead sees them as late post-exilic traditions, attempting to discredit pre-exilic traditions. George Fisher says that when it comes to the hypothesized P document, there is a disconcerting variety of positions among scholars who are experts in the field. This applies to the extent of the passages attributed to P, to its character, and its historical setting. As a result, they were all talking about different things, albeit using the term P. Furthermore, the language, the themes, and the style of these texts diverge quite a lot. P seems to be something of a chameleon. Fisher also notes their skepticism about the hypothesized J source, and many scholars have opted to refer to it as non-P. Uncertainty about a possible E source are further increased among scholars, and many deny it ever existed as an independent source. Other scholars hold to what is called the fragmentary hypothesis, which is the idea that there were various fragmented texts, documents, and oral traditions, and were combined when forming the Pentateuch. Some scholars opt for a supplementary hypothesis, which is the idea there was an early form of the Pentateuch, then it was slowly updated by a series of redactions and direct additions. And within these other 2 views, there were a variety of views as well. There are so many different approaches, it's impossible to cover them all. Scholars often seem to be working from entirely different premises. Jan Christian Gertz says, "The models continue to proliferate, but the communication seems only to diminish." Richard Hess, in speaking of the documentary hypothesis, says, "The concern here is that such widespread reordering of documents within the hypothesis destroys the neatly unified interpretation of the text, as advanced by its earlier proponents." So although proponents of the documentary hypothesis agree the Pentateuch was originally different sources, they all disagree on how to define them, how to separate each source out, and when they were written. So for this video, we'll just refer to the hypothesis as it is generally known. The idea J and E were combined into JE, then combined with P and Deuteronomy. Now, proponents of the documentary hypothesis do have reasonable arguments as to why they think the Pentateuch is a combination of 4 independent sources. For example, within the Pentateuch, we see stylistic variations, duplicate or similar narratives, repetitions, and different sections use different names for God, or different names for places and people. Mount Sinai is called Mount Horeb in other sections. Moses' father-in-law has 2 names. In fact, an early criterion for distinguishing between sources was that if a section of the Pentateuch used the name Yahweh, it likely was the J source, and if it used the term Elohim, it was either E or the P source. One of the biggest issues for source critics is finding a text with internal consistency. As Joel Baden says, "The hallmark of a unified composition, one created by a single author, is internal consistency, consistency of language and style, consistency of theme and thought, and above all, consistency of story." So the goal is to separate out sections of the Pentateuch into different sources, so that we have internal consistency across the board. Critics of the documentary hypothesis often know when we attempt to divide sources based on terms or stylistic variations, we can find literary styles assigned to P in what is a J text, or J terms or style in P, and vice versa. The scholar Joel Baden responds by noting that the defining criterion should actually be narrative flow. Attempting to divide sources on thematic and structural features does not necessarily work, because themes are, for the most part, not unique to a given source. Instead, Baden says the way we identify sources is through their narrative unity and flow. Stylistic features and changes in terms are secondary criteria. In other words, in some of the narrative sections of the Pentateuch, there are too many contradictions in what is recorded. We take something like the flood account and split it up based on the differences in the narrative, like how many animals were brought onto the ark, or which type of bird Noah released, then 2 distinct narratives emerge. Narrative flow should be the defining characteristic for determining sources on Baden's account. Baden's approach to the documentary hypothesis is a superior attempt to divide up sources in my view. And in future videos, we'll address the claim that some of the specific narratives of the Pentateuch are hopelessly contradictory and cannot work as a unified narrative. But for now, we'll focus generally on the documentary hypothesis and some of the problems with it. Although the documentary hypothesis has many proponents, it appears to have just as many, or even more, critics. In European scholarship, the documentary hypothesis has mostly fallen out of favor. Christine Hayes summarizes many of the problems with the hypothesis. One being that the whole approach may be an attempt to thrust our cultural standards onto the ancient world, and not read the Pentateuch alongside how other ancient texts were composed.
Sometimes picking apart the sources can become dry and mechanical, sometimes to the point of absurdity. Some of the people who have carried this method to its extreme will go through and almost word for word, this is J, this is E, the next word is P. It's quite remarkable how certain they feel that they can break things down almost on a word-to-word basis, as if an editor sat there with scissors and paste and were cutting out word for word and putting them together. It sometimes can reach heights of absurdity, and it can really destroy the power of a magnificent story sometimes when you carve it up into pieces that on their own don't really make all that much sense. It needs to be remembered that the documentary hypothesis is only a hypothesis, an important one and a useful one, and I certainly have used it myself. But none of the sources posited by critical scholars has been found independently. We have no copy of J, we have no copy of E, we have no copy of P by itself or D by itself. So these reconstructions are based on guesses. Some of them are excellent guesses, very well supported by evidence, but some of them are not. Some of the criteria invoked for separating the sources are truly arbitrary and extraordinarily subjective. They are sometimes based on all sorts of unfounded assumptions about the way texts were composed in antiquity. And the more that we learn about how texts in antiquity were composed, we realize that it's perhaps not unusual for a text text to use two different terms for the same thing within one story. Since we find texts in the 16th, 17th century BCE on one tablet using two different terms for a story, for two different terms to connote the same thing. So the criteria that are invoked for separating sources often ignore the literary conventions of antiquity. And the more that we learn about that, the better able we are to understand the way the biblical text was composed.
In my view, one of the biggest problems is the documentary hypothesis ignores many literary conventions of the ancient Near East. It assumes doublets, repetitions, and variations are best explained by positing a combination of different sources, instead of them merely being aspects of the literary conventions of the ancient world. As many scholars have asked, if the doublets in the final form of the Pentateuch were not a problem for the hypothesized redactor, why would they have been a problem for an original author who could have composed a Pentateuch with these features? Many years ago, Kenneth Kitchen presented a survey of various texts from the ancient world that have many of the features we find in the Pentateuch. He said that Hebrew literature shows very close external stylistic similarities to the other ancient Oriental literatures, among which, and as part of which, it grew up. Now, nowhere in the ancient Orient is there anything which is definitely known to parallel the elaborate history of fragmentary composition and conflation of Hebrew literature, or marked by just such a criteria as the documentary hypotheses would postulate. Kitchen cites the Karnak poetic stele and the Gebel Barkal stele, which contain duplicate accounts, first in general terms, and then followed by a narrative in more specific terms. Royal inscriptions from Urartu have doublets of victories achieved by the king. Kitchen says we have an H source, brief fixed style, Howdy the victor, and K source, detailed, varying formula, king as victor, if conventional literary criticism be applied. We see deities are called by different names or titles in different sections of unified works. On the Berlin stele, we see multiple names and titles used for the god Osiris. In the laws of Lipit Ishtar, Enlil is called by another name in the prologue. In the prologue of the Coda Hammurabi, we have Ishtar referred to by two names, and Nintu also called Mama. Multiple deities in the Enuma Elish have different names. The same phenomena can be seen in Canaanite, Old Arabian, and Hittite texts. Using different names is not necessarily a sign of a different author. As George Fisher remarked, the change between name and general noun, with or without article, seems to indicate specific nuances, according to the context and speaker. For varying place names, like Sinai and Horeb, the Merneptah stele uses two names for Egypt, and 5 names for the city of Memphis. On the stele of King Kamose, we see 5 different terms for boat varied throughout. In the contendings of Horus and Seth, we see 2 forms of personal pronouns. Egyptian texts also have literary works that vary in style. The biographical inscription of the Egyptian official Uni includes a narrative, a section of summary statements, a victory hymn, and 2 different refrains. The kings of Urartu also wrote with different styles and formulas. Interestingly enough, Kitchen also notes that the covenant formula, as woven throughout Exodus to Leviticus, matches the structure of Hittite treaties from the 2nd millennium BCE. But source critics often divide these chapters between different sources. Kitchen says, "We are being asked to believe in a series of separate documents, J.E., the fragments of D, suspiciously unique in form, that were combined in the course of centuries so that, by some miracle unexplained, each resulting conflated covenant corresponded with real forms, particularly of the long past late 2nd millennium, quite unknown to the imagined redactors." In other words, the way the Sinai covenant and its renewals are given in the current form have an early analog found in the surrounding culture, Hittite treaties from the 2nd millennium. So it would be odd that what we see in Exodus and Leviticus was originally different sources, and then when they were combined, miraculously matched the same structure and formula we find in Hittite treaties. Given this comparison, it seems reasonable what we find in the Pentateuch was originally a unified document that was updated and supplemented over time. Kitchen's survey is not meant to show these other texts are exactly like the Pentateuch, but merely that we can find similar practices, like doublets, repetitions, and multiple names in ancient texts. The idea these features in the Pentateuch necessarily imply multiple sources is not true. Original texts could use these same techniques without being a patchwork of multiple sources. As Joshua Berman said, examples serve as a warning flag for scholars looking to parse the text on the basis of their own notions of literary unity. The ancient text is a minefield of literary phenomena that are culturally dependent. The diachronic scholar, who treads there based solely on his own modern notions of literary unity, risks serious interpretive missteps. Additionally, other scholars have found similar results when analyzing other ancient texts. Joshua Berman adds that in the Sephira treatise, the pronouns switch between singular and plural. Richard Hess cites the text Enki and Nimma, which seems to preserve a double story of a creation-related myth, in a similar way to what we find in Genesis 1-2. Ellis Baker and A. Wells note the Middle Egyptian tombs contain formulas in classical Middle Egyptian, but contain articles of colloquial speech not found in Middle Egyptian, thereby switching back and forth from different types of language. James W. Watts notes, Egyptian myths, mortuary autobiographies, and royal inscriptions often switch from prose to hymnic poetry and back again. Joshua Berman studied the Kadesh inscription from Egypt, which is considered to be the closest parallel to the texts of Exodus 14 and 15, both from biblical and extra-biblical sources. So many scholars have noted the style and nature of the Kadesh inscription likely had early influence on biblical styles of writing. But Berman notes the Kadesh inscription, although composed by one author, is nevertheless rife with the types of intertensions and contradictions that often lead modern critics to the conclusion of revision and redaction within the text of the Hebrew Bible. It appears that Ramesses II commissioned two differing and conflicting accounts of the Battle of Kadesh and placed them side by side at several monumental sites. The two narratives are referred